Hello. I want to welcome you to this wonderful presentation as a continuation of our prison epistles. And today we'll look at the epistle to Philemon. You see, this epistle to Philemon is one of the shortest and most personal of Paul's letters. It focused on three important things. This letter to Philemon focuses on acceptance, it focuses on reconciliation, but it also focuses on forgiveness. So Timothy is one of those people that are reported in this letter because the Bible mentioned Paul, that is Philemon 1, and Timothy is also mentioned, identified as a co-sender, not as a joint author. So you need to understand that Timothy might be acquainted with Philemon somewhere in the past when Philemon journeyed to Ephesus for business. But the reading of Philemon let us know that the author is using first person plural, is mentioned once in some Greek manuscript, and especially when you read verse 7 of Philemon, because verse 7, it simply states that it says, For I have delivered my joy and comfort from your love, my brother, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you. Then the rest, if you move to verse 11, Paul addresses Philemon individually. For those verses, you can see them, verse 4, verse 7, verse 9. All these verses indicates that it is Paul addressing Philemon individually, but he mentions Timothy as a co-sender, not just as a joint author. And let's look at audience, date, and place of writing. This is also a very important aspect. So when you read the letter, you notice that the letter is written to Philemon, who lived in Colossae, because when you read verse 1, it simply says, Paul, a prisoner for Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon. So first of all, the letter is addressed specifically to Philemon. But when you continue reading, especially the same verse, it also mentioned, and Aphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house. So it's also addressed to Aphia and Archippus. And there's some people who have come to this conclusion or suggestion, probably trying to say that Aphia might be Philemon's wife and Archippus probably or possibly their son. So this is an argument that is presented by some people who try to suggest about that. But Archippus, Aphia, those were also part of the recipient of the letter. But also verse 2, where it states also in the church in your house. So that is to say that Philemon was hosting a house church, and so the letter is also addressed to the church house. You see, back then in the ancient time, there were these house churches where people could not, there are no big churches that where people could go to church, but it identify the house churches that people could gather at a home and have worship. So this is something that you need to really be aware of. So Philemon and Colossians seems to be written by Paul from the same time and the same location. When you read Colossians 4 from verse 7, you also I recognize what I'm actually trying to talk about. So reading the letter, you will simply come to notice that the style, the vocabulary, and theological themes of forgiveness and reconciliation resembles Pauline style of writing. So this is something that you need to understand. So written to Philemon, who is identified as one of those people who were wealth Christian people and businessmen, because people could not even be able to come to his own place and worship there and have a house church there if he was not a well-off person. But also you need to understand something about Philemon, that he owned slaves, and Onesimus was one of those slaves that belonged to Philemon. So this letter is a wonderful letter that is trying to let us understand all these things that happened. And the reason we call it a prison epistle is simply because Paul wrote from prison, so most likely in Rome between AD 59 and 63, because when you read especially verse 1, Paul identified himself as a prisoner. In verse 9, also Paul says, "Yet for the love's sake, I prefer to appeal to you, I, Paul, an old man and now a prisoner for Christ Jesus." So all these identify Paul as a prisoner for Jesus Christ. So this is something that you really need to be aware of. And let's look a little bit about this city of Colossae, because remember that Philemon and this house church was located in Colossae. So Colossae was a city in the Roman province of Asia, and located 161 kilometers east of Ephesus and more than 1,609 kilometers southeast of Rome in Lycus River Valley. So that is a location that you need to actually be aware of. And you need to understand that Colossae was not far from Laodicea also, and Hierapolis. So the church in these cities were not found by Paul, but were found by Epaphras. And when you read Colossians 1:7, you see Epaphras mentioned there, and you come to understand that Epaphras was actually a local inhabitant of Colossae, who had accepted the gospel due to Paul's ministry in Ephesus, and then took the news back to his family and friends in Lycus River Valley. So spreading the news to Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis. And so this is something that you need to know about it. Let me end my presentation this moment with the occasion and purpose of Philemon. You see, as I said previously, that Philemon seems to be a private letter of mediation between two individuals on behalf of a third, Paul, who was actually reconciling, was trying to reconcile Philemon and Onesimus. So you need to understand that that is the occasion of the writing. That's the main concern. Paul writes to simply reconcile Philemon and Onesimus to a new level of friendship. So you may call this as a letter of reconciliation, a letter of reconciliation, because Paul is trying to reconcile Onesimus to a new level of relationship, one which they will relate to each other no longer as master and slave, but as brothers in the Lord. This is something that you need to understand. And the background of it is simply because Onesimus was just a young man, slave in the household of Philemon, who left his master since he was unprofitable to him. And then he freed all the way to Rome. When you read verse 9, it says, "Yet for love's sake I prefer to appeal to you, I, Paul, an old man and now a prisoner also for Christ Jesus." And he appealed to him even in verse 18. He says, "If he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account." So you see, Onesimus left home without Philemon's consent, and many people have assumed that Onesimus perhaps stole from his master and then ran away to avoid punishment. But these suggestions rest on the slender evidence of verse 18 and on the common stereotype of the crafty slave. In Greek and Roman comedies, who just steal from the master and eventually buys his freedom with his master's own money, or runs away with his loot before facing the consequence. But we do not know why Onesimus fled to Rome. Some suggest that he wanted to obtain freedom and start a new life. Some assume that Onesimus was captured and ended up imprisoned with Paul, or perhaps he fled to Rome to find Paul that he would intervene on his behalf. But based on the Roman law, Paul could do the following, because Onesimus has fled. Based on Roman law, uh, Paul could have, first of all, could have arranged for Onesimus to be sold to a new master. Then the cell be returned to Philemon. That could be one option. But the second option could be Paul could have arranged for Onesimus to find refuge at the temple until he would be sold to another master or purchase his own freedom. That could be another option. But another option that Paul actually chose to do was to simply reconcile the master and the slave, which he opted. So finally, Paul sent back Onesimus from Rome to Colossae. And look that distance, because from Rome to Colossae is up 1,609 kilometers, and he sent him that distance and arranged that he would return with Tychicus, who would also bear Paul's letter to Philemon. So the book of Philemon, as I've said previously, does not tell what happened when Onesimus returned to Philemon at Colossae. However, the assumption is that Philemon responded positively to Paul's appeal, and 50 years later, early Christian Ignatius made a reference to a trip in Rome in which he met a bishop of Ephesus, a much beloved man by the name of Onesimus, which many believe it is the same person mentioned in Philemon. So this is actually a letter of reconciliation, a letter of forgiveness, a letter of harmony. Stay tuned as I'll share with you in my next presentation about some of the themes that are found in the book of Philemon. Thank you for watching, and see you next